All right. In lecture 12, we're going to do something slightly less fun, but extremely important is understanding error messages and as a beginner's guide, how to debug. Right, so why should we debugging? What is debugging? So you have already working with quite a few lines of Python codes, right? And sometimes you struggle in the codes a lot, like stuck on one piece of the problem and you couldn't get it working. So it's common, it happens all the time. So think about this question. How much time did you spend on getting your code to work properly based on your experience in the previous 5 homework examples? 10%? 90%? I would say probably 90%, right? So debugging is the definition is to get your code working. So debugging might be the most underappreciated and undertaught skill in introductory programming languages. And when you get something wrong, and the only thing is like, what's wrong with my code and how can I get it working? And this is very, very important. And the skill to learn how to get your codes working, that's essential in the improvement of your programming skills. So can I avoid debugging? It's possible, but it's usually very different. But if I want to do it, first of all, start small. Right? We know that every program starts with it starts with small pieces and trying to get pieces working step by step. And then you put everything together and you get a whole program does the thing that you want to, or keep it working. So one step at a time, make sure it works and go on to the next step, make sure it works, and in the end, get everything working. And how to debug? First of all, you need to know what your error messages are in case you have those messages. And also, you look at your codes piece by piece. So everyone could be a suspect, right? So you have to look at every line of code to figure out whether it's right or not. Now let's take a look at a simple example. And suppose that we need to write a Python program to do the following three things. First, ask a user to input the current time in terms of hours. And the second is ask a user to input the amount of hours that they want to wait, also in hours. And third one is to print out the final time after waiting, which is quite straightforward. Right? To start small, let's get the user inputs using the input function, which is the first task. Here, we use the print function to check the results. This is a simple code that I wrote. Right? So we define a variable called current time and use the input function. And there's an argument in the input function is that what is the current time in hours, which means that on the screen, it will show this string statement and it will ask the user to input a number. And the second one do the same thing. And then I print out the variable current time and wait time, see how it works. So let's run it. So if we run it and you'll say, ask the current time in hours, I put in 23. And how many hours do you want to wait? 22 and enter, 2 and enter. And then now it's printing out 23 and 2. Seems to work, right? So now let's try to add the two inputs together so you know what's the final times are waiting. So that will be the task number 3. So here's the code. So current time equals the input, wait time is also equals to another input, and I print results out. Then I define a new variable called final time, which equals to the sum of the current time and wait time, which are both of them are from the user inputs, and I print them as a variable. Right? So if I run the code, I put in 23 as the current time, and then I input 2 as wait time, and I press enter, and I got 23 and 2 printed out by these two lines of code. And then the final time is 232, which is not the same as what I want, right? Because I want will be hour 1, because it will be 23 o'clock and plus 2 hours, that'll be 1 o'clock. But now I get 232 hours. What is the problem? So because the print function takes all the keyboard's input as strings, so this is something that we were not paying attention to, because whatever you put in the print function, like here, it will be strings, right? So how do we find this problem? And if you remember what we did in the exercise in the previous lecture, is that when you add two strings together, you're basically combining the strings together. So that's how you get 2, 3, and 2, right? So how do we find this problem? Try to put the print statement to show the types of the data and you can find it. So here's what I did. So before I do any inputs, I print the time and also print the type of wait time and current time. So these are the two input variables coming from the input function here. So if I do this, I run it, and then you can see that now I get to 2 is a type of string, and 23 is also a type of string. And that can explain why we get the 232 here easily, right? So we basically combining two strings together, right? So that's how you find the problem. So you can see that when you're trying to find problems, print out either the value of a variable or the type of a variable helps a lot, right? So pay attention to the print function, which is very useful. Right, so now how do we fix it? It's really straightforward. We know that types are wrong. So what we do is that we need to convert everything to be integers before you do the numerical calculations, right? So this is what we did. So we ask the input from the screen for two variables, and they call it current time string and wait time string, right? And then we call the int function. If you still remember that, the int function converts string variables to integers. Now we got another two variables called current time integer, wait time integer, right? And then I add them together and assign the value to the final time, and I print out. And if you run the code and get 23, 2, and add them together, that's 25, right? Seems to work. So here, the trick is that after we found that the types are not right, so we use the int function to convert the string to integer, so you can do the correct numerical calculations. But the problem here is that it runs, and it does give you an hour. Numeric number is right, but the problem is that time is 25 hours, which is not right, right? Because it's hours from 0 to 24. So the trick here is that you need to fix it. We're gonna fix it using the modular operator, percent, to convert 25 to 1 by this. So one more line of the code is needed, and after we add the lines, the time hours together, we do the final time answer equals to final time string modular 24, which means that I'm only taking the remainder of the final number. And then if you do that, now the output becomes 1 o'clock, because 23, 2 hours after 23 o'clock, it's 1 in this case, right? So problem fixed. So as a good practice for coding, there's no standards because different people code differently. And it's really hard to find a standard and best, so-called best way to do coding, as long as you can get your codes working. And sometimes some people does it very efficiently. Some people does it in their own way, not so efficient, but makes things work. So in general, there are some general principles that you can follow to make your codes work efficiently and with a reasonable amount of time as a good practice for coding is that start small. For example, decompose your projects to be small pieces, right? So this is basically what I did in the previous homework assignments that I have, you know, if you recall that in the analysis problems you have done, finally you get lots of work done. On the final step, you got lots of figures generated based on all those little steps I asked you to do. So I have decomposed a complicated problem to be sub-steps for you in the homework problems, right? Maybe that's not smart enough. And when you're trying to do your own code, you should continue to decompose those small problems to be smaller steps, right? So keep it working means that every time you do a small part of code, a small piece of the code, even 1 or 2 lines of the code, and make sure they're working, which is also known as keep debugging. And also use the print function to find clues. Basically, when the code Python tells you something's wrong here, print it out. See whether the type is wrong, whether the value is wrong, whether the function name is wrong, etc. right? And also the last one is you need to understand error messages, because that's the communication feedback from Python telling you that what might be the problem. And if you understand those error messages, and you can fix it immediately if you know what's going on, right? So for example, if we have this code, and I have this code in the example notebook files, and I run it, and I got, it asked me to input one number, which I put in 23, the other I put in 2, and then if I run, continue, and I got a big piece of region, text saying something's not right. Right. So if you look at details and don't panic, because errors occur all the time, and once you have an error, means that you have something to do to fix it. So the first thing to know is that where is the error message? So if you go to the last line, and this is basically the main error message. So here it's saying name wait time int is not found, or it's not defined. And that's basically what Python's telling you what's wrong with the code. Something's not defined, right? All right, so something's not defined. And are there any more clues? Of course there are. And then if you go back to this arrow, green arrow here, it's pointing to a line with the number 5 here. So it's pointing to line number 5, saying in this line, something called wait time int is not defined. So this is the line indicator, tells you that which line is the problem or might be the problem. Sometimes the line indicator tells you this line is wrong, but the error could be in another line. Right? But mostly it's related to this line. Right? So if you know what this error message is, what does that mean, and you know where the problem is, and you can go back to the code to fix it. Right? So types of error messages, which is, there are all kinds of, lots of types, but this is a statistics coming from a book called How to Think Like a Computer Scientist with Python. And I found this interesting table that this is statistics about from a piece of code, finding the type of error message that showed up in lots of Python programs, right? So you can see that half of the program or the error message are known as parse error. And sometimes parse error is also known as syntax error, means that the language, the syntax is not right. And then the second type of error message is type error, means that either the data type, the function type, the operation, something is not wrong with the right type. And also 10% is name error, means that you're calling the wrong function name, or you're calling the wrong variable name. And value error, you could be assigning some values, integer to a string, or assign a string to an integer, something like that. So most of the errors coming from the syntax and type and name and value errors. So these are the most common errors. And sometimes you will also see indentation errors. Remember that how do Python define code blocks? Do using indentations, and sometimes indentation is not right. And index error and all these, and you will see more of these errors when you have more experience. All right, so nearly 9% of error message encountered for this problem, or in general Python code, are syntax, parse error, type error, name error, and value errors. And we will take a look at these errors in the following three stages. First, we will define what these type of errors are. Then we will look at some examples and how these errors are caused. And finally, we will look at a way to help uncover the root cause of these errors, and using the Jupyter Notebook file. All right. So the first thing I want you to make sure you have is that if you click the view, if you open the Jupyter Notebook and you click the View tab and scroll down and select the toggle line numbers, and then the line numbers here will show up in your code. And then when Python, the line indicator tells you what is wrong, and then you can go to that line to fix it. All right, so let's go to the Python notebook, and I'm going to show you how to understand error messages, what those error messages usually mean, and how do we fix some simple codes. And then you can use these skills in your following class. Okay, Let's take a look at some examples of error messages in the Lecture 12 Jupyter Notebook file and try to understand what are those error messages and what might be causing them and how to use the error messages to fix your code. All right, so let's start with the example code that we didn't discuss in the lecture notes, is that we're trying to get two input hours and add them together as the final results. Right. So if I run the code, I got asked for the first time, which is 23, and I want, how many hours do I want to wait? That's 2, right? Seems all right because these are those 2 lines of code. Then I type enter, and I got an error that it's called a name error, and the name current time int is not defined, and it's telling me that in line 4, and this one is not defined. All right. So what's the problem here? The problem here is that very clear that in line 4, something is not defined. So let's go to line 4, see what it is, right? So now you can see that it's complaining that a variable is not defined called current time int. So what this line does is to convert a variable called current time int, use the integer function, and then give it back to the variable called current time int, right? So is this defined? Let's take a look at the previous lines. Apparently it's not, because this code is asking for a variable called current time int, but it never occurred in any of line 1 and 2. So this is the problem here. This one is not defined, right? So how do we fix it? So the problem here is that there's a typo because I'm trying to convert this variable to integer. So I should use string here, and then I run it again. 23, 2. There's another error, right? It's the same thing. Okay, the wait time int is not defined, right? So you go back to this line 5, and you can see that I made the same mistake here because wait time int is not used before line 5 because all I have is called wait time string. So I need to change this to wait time string in this way, and I run it again. I got 23, 2, try to add them together. Ta-da, got 25. Right? So this example tells you that something is not defined. So that's called a name error because you find a name that's never used before. So in this case, it was this variable that was never used, and I refix it, right? So this is a table that I showed you the number of errors in some of the code, and then you can just take a look at it, and most of the errors are parse error, which is basically syntax error, type error, and name error and value errors. And let's take a look at examples what those are. Right? So parse errors, and they're coming from mostly syntax. So parse error usually it's the same as syntax error, and it's just like when you're writing something, your grammar is incorrect. Right? So you need to fix your syntax by looking at what's going on with your writing or with your code. You might be missing something really simple. Right? So let's take a look at example of parse error or syntax error here. So if I run this code, it's the same kind of code. I ask to input 2 numbers and I convert them to integers and add them together in this case, right? So if I run it and it says syntax error, right? So here, this is the error message called syntax error. And sometimes depending on your version of Python and interpreter, sometimes it tells you it's a parse error. So parse errors, syntax errors, they're the same thing. So in line 4, so the line indicator, because there's only a couple of lines. So it's in line 4, this one is incorrect. Right? So now let's go back to line 4 in this case. So line 4 says I'm converting current time string to current time int. And is it defined? And of course this is defined because that's basically the same variable here. But then what's the problem? It seems like it's not a problem, right? So I'm stuck. I don't know what happened here, right? So how do we proceed? Starting, so now the idea is starting from small. So how do we start from small? Is that make sure every line works. All right, so how do I do that? The first thing to do is that I'm gonna, it's complaining that line 4 has got a problem, right? So let's comment it out. So I'm gonna run it again. I got the same error again, but something changed. It says line 5 has a syntax error, but it seems like I'm using the same syntax. Otherwise, I'm too silly, right? I make the same error twice in 2 lines. It's possible, but it's kind of silly, right? So let's keep commenting it out and run again. Now it's invalid syntax in line 7. So something's apparently wrong when I'm commenting everything out. And then I'm commenting every out. I just have the first 2 lines. I start with small. Let's make sure every line works. So let's see if the first 2 lines works here. If you run again, all right, now something's different here. It says unexpected EOF, which means end of file while parsing. So it means that your file is not ending properly. All right, so now let's go back to the code because these are comments and they will never be run. In this case, the problem must be from the last line, right? So in the end, we're missing a parenthesis here, right? Because the input, you need the right parenthesis here. So if I put in, problem should be fixed, right? In this case, I got 23, 2, and done, right? Now you can come back to your original code and make sure everything works, right? 23, 2 works again. And then, add them together and print out. So now the whole code is working, 23, 2, and 25, right? So this is how you find the code. So this is telling you that the error problem was originally showing up in line 4, but the actual error was a line before that, which means that because this parenthesis was missing, so Python could not tell how does this code working, because this one will be connected to that one. So no matter how many lines you commented out, it will trace back to the last line. But the problem was from line 2. Right, so this is telling you that the syntax error could be remote, could be somewhere else before your current line of error. Right, so here's another example of the syntax error. And let's take a look at this code, and it looks very similar. So we're trying to put things together and add them together, and let's run it. And it's telling you that in line 1, it says invalid syntax. So the syntax is wrong in line 1, which means that I don't need to comment these things out, but I just can take a look at line 1. And what happens here is that you can see that the string is not parsed correctly, right? So it's a double quote down here, but now I'm continuing using double quotes. So Python will say, oh, this is a string, and this is a string, but what the heck is going on here? Right? So that's not right. So what you want to do is you want to change the single quote. Then you can have the quote inside a string, right? So if you do that, and you can see these single quotes down here, right? So the problem is now fixed. It's running 23, 2, I got 25, right? So that's the basic idea of what syntax error is. So syntax error are usually coming from your bad missing a parenthesis, missing a comma, missing some important style, wrong style things. So you will see more when you're trying to debug your own code. Right. So the next one is called type error. So type error occurs when you try to combine 2 objects together, but they're not the same type. Or you're trying to calculate something with the wrong data type, right, based on name. That's called a type error. So now let's take a look at a simple code, which is quite funny. It's in Polish, right? So this code does is asking you to input an hour and input how many number of hours you want to do, and then let's convert that to the final hour. It's the same idea, right? So if you run this, all right, so it seems like it's working. So ask you to input hour, I'm going to 23 again, and input number of hours you want to waiting, so 2, right? So see how it goes. I type in, you got an error, and it says it's a type error. And error message is now type error, so that it's a different type of error message, and say unsupported operand types for divide. and string and int. So this is actually a very clear message telling you what's wrong. And the next one is to look at which line it is run. So if you go back to the code, it says line 5. So now let's go back to line 5 here. And what you see here is you can kind of see that you're trying to you did the get the input hour, which is A, and input hour, which is X here, right? So we do the convert int X and int A. So trying to convert them to be integers, and I use the divide, which is hour divided by 24 in this case. Seems all right. So why it's complaining? But it's clearly that telling you that you're trying to divide a string with an integer in this case, right? So how do we do that? Which is relatively straightforward because Python is complaining about the data type. So what you can do is basically do this. And before, and let's say, because line 5 is wrong, so let's comment everything out below line 5. And if you run it, all right, so 23, 2. So, all right, so the error message is exactly here. And we know that 24, that's not a problem, divide not problem, but the problem must be coming from the data type of X, right? So let's print the type of X down here, right? So if I run the code, all right, I need to put in again 24, 2. So you can see that, oops, it didn't show up. Sorry, I need to put this above that code. Before I call the use the X, I print the type of X. So if I run again, 23, 2, and then you can see that I got an additional output, which is class string, which tells me that the data type of X is string. Now you know exactly what the problem is because X is a string, and then you're trying to divide the string by an integer. So this is exactly what that error message is telling you. So you're trying to use the operator, but you're dividing a string by an integer in this case. Right? So what happened here is that we did the conversion. Right? We convert X to the int, but we did not assign this value back to X, which means that X is still in string. Whatever this is done, it's not assigned to anything. Right? So what you need to do to fix code is that assign the value to X and also assign the value to A in this case. And let's take this out. And if you run it, 23, 2, you're done. Right? So now the code, now the code works. Right? So this is exactly how a typo error can cause, and usually caused by the fact that you're trying to use wrong data type for calculations, right? So that's, and also you've seen the way how we debug the code using the print function. And here I'm printing out the data type before the error message that I know what was going on in the code. All right, so here's another example to look at and see if you can fix it. The same thing. I ask input, what time is it now? And how many hours do you want wait? And I convert these to integers and I add them together and print it out, right? So if I run it, first line's fine. What time is it now? It's 23. How many hours do you want to wait? I want to wait for 2 hours. And if I do that, and you can see I got another error message called typo error, unsupported operand types for plus in line 7, in line 6. So I'm trying to add integer and string together. So you can see that this is plus. So I'm trying to add the time and the string time together here. And you can see where is time? So time is here, is coming from line 3. It's converting string time to time. And now, what is string time? And it's actually the raw input from the input function, which is a string, right? So that is not right. So the problem here is that you need to fix this one. What I want is I want to add the wait time instead of a string time, right? So what happens here should be wait time. So this one is the convert of the string wait time rather than the other one, right? So here's another example that we can you see a lot in type errors. So here, let's take a look at. I defined a list called names with all these first names, and I have a for loop to print all the names using a for loop in this case, right? So for I is my iterator in range 6. So range 6 starting from 0, stop at 5, increase by 1. Right, so that's a series from 0 to 5 of 0 to 5 of these range. And I print name parenthesis I. Right, so if we run the code, you get exactly an error message called type error. Right, now it's type error in line 4, which is this line here. It says list object is not callable. Right, so that's not very easy to understand. It's like very computer type of language. What does that mean? So what does that mean is that the list object, you're trying to call the list object as a function down here. So that's why it's not callable. But I never tried to call it. I just tried to print the elements out. So what was the problem? And now let's go back to here to see it, right? So here I got names, which is my list, but I might have parenthesis I. Remember that how do you access elements in a list? There must be square brackets, right? Now here I'm using parentheses, means that I'm treating the name, the variable name here as a function. So whenever you call a function, you always use parentheses, but you're trying to access an element, you don't use parentheses, you use square brackets, right? So the problem here is that Python, now you're trying to call a function called names, but it's actually a list. So it's not callable. And what you do is that we need to convert this to square brackets. And if you run it, and then you get all the names print out. So that's also type error because you're trying to access a list, but you're using the function type, which is not the right type. All right. So let's take a look at another type of error that occurs a lot is that name error. Sometimes these are easy errors to fix, right? So for example, it's the same thing. Let's do an integer, ask you to input what time is it now and convert to integer. And then I do input how many hours do you want to wait? And I convert to integer and then I divide by the hour. Get the remainder by 12. Right, so if you run this code and the first line is 5, it's 2, and then you continue to go, and it says something's wrong, and the error is called name error. So it says the name I am int is not defined, and in line 2, which is a very silly error, right? Because you can see that in line 2, I'm trying to call a function called int, n, which wasn't the right code that I want to do. I want to convert n, which is the input string, to be an integer, but I mistyped the function name as int instead of int, right? So that's really straightforward to fix, right? If I fix it, and then I got 2, 3, and time is now 3, and it's all fixed, right? In this case. Okay, so let's take another example of the name error. It's the same thing. So I'm trying to input the time from the input to the variables from the screen, or then I add them together, right? So if I run this code and I say, what's the present time? It's 23 hours. And set hours for alarm, I want 6. And see how many hours do I want? And something's not right. And now you get another error called name error. It says name error in line 3, and it says name set time is not defined. All right, so now let's go back to line 3. So in line 3, I'm trying to convert these things to be integers, and it's complaining that one of them is not defined. So set time here is not defined. All right, so you can see that set time, is it defined in line 2 and 3? Line 1 and 2? It's not. The only one I have is called present time and set alarm. And there's nothing called set time, right? So that's why I'm using a variable that did not exist at that time. right? So you need either to define this variable or do something else. So that's also a name error. You're trying to access some variable that did not exist. All right, so when you're trying to use Python modules, and there's another type of error that occurred a lot to me sometimes, is that you use the wrong name of the module, right? So let's take a look at an example of this, trying to draw the heart curve, if you still remember in homework number 3. So I'm using the NumPy module and matplotlib module here, trying to draw a circle using a parameter function here, right? So if I run the code, and you get an instant error, says name error in name NP is not defined in line 4. All right, so now let's go to line 4, which is here. So I'm defining a variable t equals to np.linspace, linspace, a linear space, dividing from 0 to 2 pi and with 100 points in this case. But it seems right, but because that's the code we used a lot before with NumPy. But it says NumPy, NP is not defined. How come? Right, so let's go back to where is NP imported, which is the first line. You see the problem here, right? Because we import NumPy, but we never give it a nickname as NP, right? So the problem here is that you could either do this, import NumPy as NP, and then let's run it. Ta-da, you get red heart, right? Which is really nice. Otherwise, you can either change this, remove NP and use NumPy, which is the 4 name. All right, so let's take a look at another one. It's called value error. So value error usually occurs when you pass a parameter to a function, but the function is expecting a certain limitations on the values or the types of values, and that doesn't work this way, right? So now let's go back to the same example. We're trying to get 2 times, which is the current time, and the wait time, and we add the 2 together and we print it out to screen. Right. So it seems to work in this case. And we know that the code works in this way, 23, 2, and it's 25, right? So sometimes value errors can come from that way that your input is not expected as your code. For example, let me run it again. So what's the current time? If I don't input anything, just put enter, the code is going to be wrong, because when I don't input any numerical numbers, strings, and it's telling you it's value error, because you're trying to input, we didn't get anything. We give empty to the string called current time string, and I tried to convert empty to an integer, which Python says, oh, that's not a value I want. Right. So in this case, and the value errors, sometimes they may not come from your code, but they may be coming from the parameters that you're used when you're using your code in this case. All right. So the next one is also a very common error, is called index error. And you can learn by the name that index error means that you're messing up with the index of the array or the string in this case, right? So let's go back to this code, and we have names, which is a list of 6 names. And then I'm trying to print out everybody in the list, right? I in range 7, which is 0 to 6, and I print it out. If I run this code, and you can see that Python print out all the names, John, Peter, Mike, Jackson, Sam, and Kevin. But then it still gives me an error here called index error in line 4, which is trying to printing error, right? It's saying list index out of range. What is that? What does that mean? It means that I'm trying to access something that does not exist, right? So before you do that, and there's multiple ways to do it, and this example is so simple that you can know immediately that. So for I equals to range 7, it's going to be from 0 to 6, right? So when I equals 0, and that's John, 1, that's Peter, and you all the way go to 5, that's Kevin. But what is name 6? It doesn't exist. because the list only has 6 names, but you're trying to access the 7th one, which does not exist. So that's called list of index out of range. And this happens a lot in codes that are you're trying to loop over a NumPy array or a pandas column or whatever, and you're going out of bound in the access, right? So usually for this kind of things, I will do print I and then print the name of I. And if I run it again, and you can see that 0 is John, 1 got a Peter, and all the way blah blah, and 5 got Kevin, which name 5 Kevin, and then Python print out 6, and it stopped. And now it's telling you in line 5 the name 6 is out of range, and you know exactly what was wrong here, right? So you should change this to 6, and you're all right. All right, so this is also an index error. So index error usually comes that you're trying to access something using the index method, and it doesn't exist. It's out of bound. Right. So there's another very simple error that I make this kind of error almost like in every code, but it's really easy to identify. It's called indentation error. And you can tell from the name that indentation error means that you're not doing the right indentation as a Python code block. As we said, that Python differentiate codes by code blocks by indentations, right? So for example, if we run this code, and you can see that I have a for loop, and I have a for loop. I loop over I from range 1 to 20. And if it's divisible by both 3 and 5, I print out fizzbus. If only multiplied of 3, I do fizz. Otherwise, I print out bus, which is very straightforward. But now Python is complaining that something's not right with the indentation in line 7. So that's the line, which is very straightforward because this is the code block that does the elif, except these 2 conditions, but print was not indented properly, right? So let's do 1, 2, 3, 4, right? So now if you run it, and it's all right, right? So I'm looping over the index I from 1 to 20 and see if they're multiplied by both 3 and 5, or either 5 or 3 in this way, right? So these are very simple examples of error messages and how you debug your code in this case. And it's really not the real, in a practice in a practical way, applications, it's really more complicated than these, but these are start points. And you need to understand what your error message, where it is, and you're trying to fix by commenting out some part of your code, and also by print out the data type, index, and things to make out that your code's right. But the best practice to me is still that you start small. And for example, you're writing 10 lines of codes, and whenever you write 2 or 3 lines with a reasonable amount of work, and run it, see if it works. If it works, then move on to the next 2 lines, next 3 lines, and trying to make things together. Okay, now let's take a look at another 2 examples of how do you do debugging usually based on the error message that Python tells you. Right, so I'm going to show you how I do it in the first 2 examples to give you a sense that how you think about debugging, and I'll leave the rest 4 problems to you as a practice to find out the problems. All right, so first of all, one is list and sets. Right, so we give a list called with these variables, and I want to change the 4th element to be true and print out all the elements in my list. So I wrote this code, my list equals to these elements, and I want to change my list to 4 to be true, and I print out. Right. So when I run the code, Python immediately tells me index error and list assignment index out of range in line number 2. And you know that index error usually means that you're trying to access something that is out of the range. And apparently here, I'm just trying to change the fourth element to be true. And I'm using my list 4 equals to true. And you can tell that because Python starts from 0. So 4 is the 5th element rather than the 5th element. It did not exist. So that's why Python's complaining that the index out of range in line 2, right? So the right thing to do is change this to 3, right? So if I print out, and I got everything, right? So that error is fixed, but the problem is I only got the index, not the elements, right? So what you need to do here is you need to change, instead of using I, use mylist I, right? So the next thing is that I'm giving a set of A 234.3, and can you change the second element to be pi? And let's try it. So I do the my set equals to that. I'm changing the second one to be pi. And then if I do that and run it, and Python give me that set object does not support item assignment, which means that you cannot change a set object within an indexed object into a set, because sets are not ordered. So there's no index accessing using that, right? So you cannot. So the only thing you can do is, this line is impossible, but then I can still print it out. If I comment this out, and it says, if you do that, it says my set.I is not, it's a type error, set object is not subscriptable, which means that because the sets are not ordered, right? They're unique values, but they're not ordered. So you cannot use index slicing on sets. So whenever you're trying to add my set 0, 1, 2, 3, it's not going to work, right? So that's the problem. And to fix it, you cannot use this index slicing method to work out, right? To print it out. So what you can do is you can say I in my set print I. If you do that, all the elements are printed out, right? So you step over elements in a set instead of using index method. All right, so in this code, let's take a look at this code. So this code, it gives you the following list with lots of elements, and write a program to count the numbers of integers in the list to use a for loop and print to the results. Right. So I define my list down here, and I use a for loop, use item in, this is the membership operator in my list. So item is going to step through all the elements. And then if it's equals to integer, is instant, compare the type of item and integer if that's true. I add number int equals to number int plus 1. So that's my counter of how many integers. If it's true, I add 1. If it's true, I add 1. If it's not true, you're not adding it to it, right? So then I print out the number integer. Looks pretty straightforward, right? But when you try to run it, you got syntax error here. All right, so it's in line 1 saying, so look at this little tick down here, it's tilde here, telling you that around this, in this code, and there's a syntax error. So let's go to the code here. So it's 1, 4, 5.3, hello, and there's no comma, right? So you're missing comma down here. That's why it's a syntax error. All right, so let's run again. Not done. Right, so now let's say it's now the tilde moved down here, the hat moved down here, says pi here, you got a syntax error. So let's take a look. So this pi is a string, but it seems all right, right? So now let's take a look at before it, and you can see that 3.1 dot pi instead of 3.1 comma pi. Right, so that's also syntax error because Python will know 3.1 dot pi. That's something I don't recognize. All right, so run it. Is it done? No, not yet. All right, so it says in line 5, you got another invalid syntax, right? So line 5 is this one. If is instant compares the item integer, whether that equals to true, and this looks fine to me. But why this is syntax error? Seems all right. This is also a very common error that I usually make when I write code, is that I'm missing this one end of an if statement, right? So make sure you have this little guy down here after if, else if, and for loops as well. So that one was missing. And if I do this, when it seems to be working. All right. So this is how you do the debugging with these examples, and you can go through your codes. And when Python tells you some error message, and then you just go back to your code and look one by one. And you can see that this is well, actually this is not exactly done, because I'm printing out the results so many times. I'm printing out the results 12 times. So the idea is here is that because of indentation. So there's another like invisible error here. Indentation is that I am looping over all these variables, and I print out the number count every time in the for loop. So the right way to do is I need to make sure my indentation is right. And then if you do that, and number of integers 18, yeah, because I run it 3 times, I didn't define it. All right. Okay, anyway, it's relatively straightforward to go through these examples, and if you can go through, you know, these problems and trying to see if you can find those errors, and that helps a lot in your future, you know, programming. It's not going to be enough, and the way that to improve is practice, practice, practice. So this is the first step. All right.